It's an honor to be back here. I was at a Day of Reason brunch many years ago when Jennifer Michael Hecht was the speaker. I think it was about 7 years ago now. And I think that was the last one I was at because, as some of you are aware, I've moved to Washington, D.C. and live down there now. So there are some familiar faces in the audience. I lived in New York City from 2005 to 2012. And as part of my time in New York City, I spent as executive director of the Center for Inquiry's branch in New York City, which for all intents and purposes does not necessarily exist anymore, although they kind of have a presence on Meetup and some of the other social media websites. But I was the full-time director here, and so I actually worked very closely with John.
And with very well.
And with
a big friend of the society.
With many of you who are in the audience, in fact. I should just note really quickly before going to some of my remarks that Rich Sanders in the audience, and without Rich, actually, I may have never found any humanist organization in New York City. The first event I ever went to in New York City back in 2007 was an atheist event that I wasn't really into, I wasn't really feeling, but Rich called me on the way out and said, you should really explore the whole spectrum of humanists and secularist organizations in New York City, and so I found the Secular Humanist Society of New York. I found many other organizations, eventually got involved to the point where the Center for Inquiry thought that they should actually pay me to do the work that I was doing. I was very fortunate. So I worked in New York City for the Center for Inquiry from 2009 to 2012, and then in 2012, after finishing my master's degree in political theory, they asked me if I wanted to move down to Washington, D.C. and launch an office of public policy and kind of oversee all the advocacy that the organization wanted to do around the world, on Capitol Hill, and at the grassroots. And I jumped at the opportunity. Not that I don't love New York City, but I thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of put a lot of the ideas and stuff that I've been doing in New York City into real practice in terms of trying to get political impact. So, as John said, I'm the Director of Government Affairs and the main representative to the United Nations for the Center for Inquiry. So that basically means that all the political advocacy that the Center for Inquiry is doing, I'm overseeing it, whether it's in Ohio or in the halls of Congress or in the halls of the United Nations. What I'm going to kind of give a brief overview about is not necessarily just the work I'm doing, but some of the work that secular, humanist, atheist organizations are doing, politically speaking, right now in the current climate we're in, and over the past couple of years. One thing that would be helpful just to keep in mind is to think back about 2 decades ago. I was 14 years old at the time, and I had no idea what atheism or humanism was. But 2 decades ago, there were 0 humanist, secular, atheist organizations that had any sort of relevant presence in politics. Sure, there were relevant secular and humanist organizations. Paul Kurtz had built up the Center for Inquiry, the American Humanist Association, Freedom from Religion Foundation were doing great work. But politically, they were not on Capitol Hill, they were not in the halls of the United Nations. And humanists and atheists did not really have an organization that were fighting for their values in those ways. What's been interesting is how quickly that's changed. In the past decade, in particular, there's been a tremendous growth in both the number of humanist and atheist organizations involved in politics and political advocacy, but also the impact that those organizations are having. So you're probably thinking to yourself that you probably know some of those organizations. So I want to just give a kind of brief overview of what those organizations are. Which organizations am I talking about, and what are the kinds of work that they're doing? Domestically speaking, and so I'm going to split things up slightly, domestically and internationally, although you'll see that there's there's a close relationship between the two. Domestically speaking, there are really 4 organizations that are active in terms of political advocacy. You have the Secular Coalition for America, which was the first one that started in 2002. So they've been around the longest, and they've been engaged the longest in political advocacy, particularly in Washington, D.C., but also across the United States. And so the Secular Coalition has a presence in the majority of the states in the U.S., where they're trying to advocate for secular values, separation of church and state. The American Humanist Association, also very active down in Washington, D.C., and they were obviously deeply involved in discussing political issues for a very long time as an organization, but it was really in the early 2000s where they started to dedicate a lot more resources to getting involved in formal political advocacy on Capitol Hill. So that's when they started hiring people with titles like Director of Government Affairs or Legislative Assistant, things like that. The Center for Inquiry had a very short stint in being involved in public policy from about 07 to 09. That was something that was unfortunately hit pretty hard by the economic crisis. And so it was in 2012 that I was asked to go down to DC and really start that over. And then in 2015, American Atheists hired Amanda Knief and sent her down to Washington, D.C. to be their full-time lobbyist. So there are really 4 organizations in Washington, D.C. with a presence. The Secular Coalition and the Center for Inquiry actually share an office, so we're in the same space. But there are really 4 organizations in Washington, D.C. engaging in political advocacy. Now, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is also very involved in national affairs, but the only thing that the Freedom from Religion Foundation does, and they do it very well, is legal affairs. So they only bring lawsuits and engage themselves in legal issues. So they don't have a representative in Washington, D.C., or really at the state level engaging in the political process. As you can imagine, the issues that these organizations work on are, we have a pretty large overlap. I would say that the kind of organizing principle for the Secular Coalition, for American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and the American Humanist Association is a defense of the First Amendment. I think the First Amendment is where we kind of come together and focus our energies on, and when we go into rooms, we really say that we're here to defend the First Amendment. Now, we have reasons why we want to defend the First Amendment. Part of them are the fact that we're humanists, and we think that the First Amendment is a really good thing. We think separation of church and state is a really good thing. I think that for me, and for a lot of the organizations we're working for, our determination that the First Amendment is important actually derives from our humanist values, not the other way around. But the First Amendment has been a big organizing principle for us, and in a number of ways. There are very traditional battles that you can imagine that organizations like the Secular Coalition and the Center for Inquiry are working on. Religious monuments on public lands, things of that nature. Somebody trying to put up the 10 Commandments in a courthouse. Someone trying to, create a law like in Tennessee where the Bible is the official book of the state, things of that nature. These are very traditional battles that we're fighting over. But as time has gone on, we've gotten past, I wouldn't say gotten past necessarily in a negative way, we've gotten past or had to get past some of those traditional battles to fight other battles that are going on Capitol Hill and in state houses that are related to the First Amendment, but are not some of the traditional battles that atheist and humanist organizations have been working on. I would say that in Washington, D.C. in particular, one of the issues that we've been most active on in terms of the 4 organizations working collectively has been trying to prevent Congress and the administration now from taking billions and billions of taxpayer dollars, billions and billions of your taxpayer dollars, although I don't think all of your taxpayer dollars add up to all the billions, but billions and billions of taxpayer dollars and sending them to private religious schools through a school voucher scheme. This has been one of the biggest issues that we've been working on. It's one of the issues we've been most active on because it would be the beginning of the end, you could argue, for the public education system, which is a secular system which provides a free public education for everyone and which we consider a common humanistic good, as I would call it. What a lot of members of Congress want to do and what the current administration want to do is they want to take all the federal funding that they give out for public education, which is predominantly at the federal level for schools that need it the most, and send that off to private and religious schools. And so Catholic schools and whatnot would be getting that money to choose which students they want to take from the public schools that would try to be leaving. I have to say that this is actually one area we've been very successful at. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, some of the accomplishments that we have. At the beginning of this afternoon, John was talking about the Johnson Amendment, which is the 1954 law that prevents churches and other houses of worship and tax-exempt organizations from engaging in partisan politics, by which I mean endorsing or opposing political candidates for office or campaigning or for or against political candidates. And this administration has made promise after promise on the campaign trail and after winning the election that they want to completely destroy and get rid of the Johnson Amendment. And some members of Congress have been talking about this as well. In fact, there was a hearing on Thursday in the House about how churches are being deprived of their free speech rights. And yeah, I don't think anyone in this room believes that churches are being deprived of their free speech rights, but I'm going to give you some numbers later that will quickly show how that's not the case. So separation of church and state, First Amendment issues, big organizing principle for us, freedom of expression. However, there's another kind of side to our advocacy that we engage in, which is the science and the skepticism side of our advocacy. And that is fully ingrained in the work that we're doing. So it's not as if the secular coalition only cares about the First Amendment and not about science issues. They care about science issues as well. And so we're working very closely on all manner of issues. I don't have to tell you, you all watch the news, there's a pretty significant anti-science sentiment right now on Capitol Hill. The people in Congress who run the science committees, the House and Senate committees that handle science issues, are people that don't think that science is real. And so we have an immense uphill battle on things like...
Or their funders don't think that...
Or their funders don't think that science is real, and so they're required to not think that they're real. There is a certain economic aspect to this. And so there are some traditional issues we work on. Climate change, one, advancing the idea that climate change is real, but we've also spent as an organization at the Center for Inquiry and collectively our organizations a lot of time trying to go after the climate science denialism. So it's not so much just actually articulating the evidence for climate change, but also talking about the reasons why people, for example, want to deny climate science. And it could be economics, it could be other kind of political impact, it could be God would never destroy the earth. He created it for us, and so climate change couldn't possibly be real. We've heard that. We've heard that. One other science issue that we do a lot of work on, the Center for Inquiry particularly does a lot of work on this, is alternative medicine. A couple years ago, the Food and Drug Administration announced that they were going to review the way that they regulate homeopathy, by which they meant they were going to review the way that they don't regulate homeopathy. And the FDA actually sent us a letter inviting us to testify at this hearing, that they were going to hold a 2-day hearing in Silver Spring, Maryland. So they invited me to come and deliver testimony, and I went and delivered testimony. It was quite interesting. It was not at all what I was expecting it would be. Just to set the scene very quickly, in Silver Spring, Maryland, at the FDA campus, you walk into the room, and I thought it would be kind of like a congressional briefing or a congressional hearing. So the members of Congress are set up on these, kind of high-rise benches. I thought, well, that's where the FDA would be sitting, the people from the FDA, and then you would come in and you would testify to them, and there would be an audience behind you. But no, it wasn't set up like that. It was actually set up kind of like a lecture for the Secular Humanist Society of New York, where the people who are going up to present their arguments are presenting to the full audience with the FDA next to you. So I got to tell a room full of homeopathic doctors and experts that homeopathy doesn't work, which was very interesting. I got some boos and hisses, but I got through it, and the FDA came up to me afterwards and said, those are great remarks. What's happened since then is, since the FDA is kind of kicking the can down the road, they don't really want to address this, the FTC has actually come out in the last couple of years and said, well, if the FDA is not going to do anything on the medical side, the medicine side of this, we're going to go after them in terms of the way that they market these things. And then they invited us to provide comments on that. We provided comments on that. The FTC just put out a couple months ago some new guidelines in which they're going to be cracking down on homeopathic manufacturers and the way that they kind of market their products to people in terms of what they can claim that their products do. And so this was actually a massive achievement for us, and I'm going to, again, talk about some of the accomplishments that we've had later. But this is something that the Center for Inquiry has been so to some extent alone on because it's kind of a niche issue, the alternative medicine issue. We think it's very important, though. As I said before, though, the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, and the science side of our advocacy actually overlap. There are two areas in particular where they really overlap. One is on religious exemptions. There has been a tremendous push by members of Congress and at the state level, members of state legislatures who are conservative and religious, because they see the advance of LGBT rights, they see the advance of other areas of rights, and so instead of actually trying to push their own agenda now, what they're asking for is exemptions from having to follow any of the laws that have been passed in their state or at the federal level. And this mainly comes in the area of LGBT rights, but also happens in a large number of healthcare areas, particularly contraception. You got a lot of people who are in Congress trying to propose any kind of bill they can to get religious exemptions. And so that's an area in which a First Amendment issue, religious privilege, also interplays with science issues, because we know the effectiveness of the health care that we're trying to provide. It's just that because someone's religious, they don't want to provide this. Another area very acutely where this interplays is issues of reproductive health care. So contraception is one issue, but abortion is another issue. There was a case in the Supreme Court last year that we filed an amicus brief in the Center for Inquiry, because that's one of the things that we do, in which we got 40 scientists to sign on to this amicus brief. And what was interesting about the case is that we got called by the Center for Reproductive Rights. They called us up and said, we want you to file a brief in this case. And we said, oh great, we'll file like a First Amendment thing, because the religious reasoning that they're using to argue against abortion in Texas, because that's where the case started, is a First Amendment violation. They said, no, that's not what we want. We want you to get as many scientists as possible to talk about the scientific reasons that they're using being not based in actual science. So we filed that brief. We ended up winning that case. I mean, the Center for Inquiry wasn't arguing it, but it's a good example of how the role that religion plays and the role that separation of church and state plays in a lot of the advocacy that we're doing interplays with a lot of different areas of the work that we're doing.
Could you just explain what an amicus brief is?
Oh, sure. So when a case gets all the way up to the Supreme Court, it's basically a friend of the court brief. So what you can do if you're an organization who is registered with the Supreme Court, like the Center for Inquiry is if there's a case before the Supreme Court that you find really interesting and close to your mission, so the Center for Inquiry cares, for example, about a separation of church and state case, say about money going to a religious organization. If the case is brought by, say, the ACLU, the Center for Inquiry can still submit a brief to the Supreme Court on that case, making particular arguments relative to what the Center for Inquiry's mission is. Now, how effective are these Supreme Court briefs? Hard to really know. We know that the Supreme Court justices sure ain't reading those things. It's definitely their clerks reading those things. But they can actually have an impact on the way that some of the justices eventually end up thinking about their decisions, especially if you write a particularly compelling one that's very targeted. So if you have 40 scientists signing onto something about an abortion case where you're deconstructing the scientific arguments, you may actually have a greater chance of an impact in that case than one in which you're just saying separation of church and state is great. Look at what Thomas Jefferson wrote in his letter to the Danbury Baptists a long time ago, right? The justices know about that stuff. They want really compelling new information. So that's the domestic, that's a kind of brief wrap of the domestic stuff. Internationally, there's also a lot of activity by secular humanist organizations. There are, to my count, currently 5 organizations really involved in international affairs that hold a secular humanist perspective. And the main way in which these organizations are involved in international affairs is at the United Nations. So as a nonprofit organization, you can apply to the United Nations for 2 different types of status. One is called the Department of Public Information. That kind of status doesn't really get you anything. It doesn't really get you in any doors. You get to go to an annual conference at the UN, and they talk about all the stuff that's going on at the UN. But the other status that's really elusive and hard to get, but if you can get it, you get in the back doors, in the back rooms, is called special consultative status. And so a number of secular humanist organizations have gone through the route to get this. The first one was the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is a London-based group, and John Wagner's in the room here. He's the New York representative of the International Humanist and Ethical Union. They got their status in 2000. There's a guy named Roy Brown, who's now retired, but he's the one that fought for that. And so he gets in the rooms, he gets in those back rooms, and he says, got to have more humanist organizations there. So he calls up Paul Kurtz and says, Center for Inquiry, you got to get on this. You got to apply for special consultative status. So they do it. Center for Inquiry gets their special consultative status in 2005. And then since then, we've had a lot more groups join. So in 2012, the British Humanist Association got their status. In 2013, the Atheist Alliance International got their status. And then most recently, the European Humanist Federation in 2014 got their status. So there are 5 secular humanist atheist organizations with special consultative status at the United Nations, which basically means that you can go to the United Nations Human Rights Council, you can go to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, you can go to special conferences as a non-governmental organization representative and go in there and deliver statements, submit written statements, try to corner the representative from Saudi Arabia in a hallway and press them on why they've jailed some blogger. So you get a lot of access that other nonprofit organizations don't get. The main issues that we work on at the United Nations, I would say, fall into 3 categories. 1, freedom of religion, belief, and expression. At the United Nations, those are 2 different areas of human rights. Freedom of religion or belief, which is the term that they use, which is a good thing because it started out as freedom of religion, and then they added the or belief part to include people like us. And the freedom of expression track is somewhat separate, although there's obviously a lot of interplay between those 2. The second area is issues of women's rights around the world. As I don't need to really remind you, most often situations where women are being subjugated, deprived of their rights, are situations in which people who are in power are using religion to justify their subjugation of women. The third area that we've recently started to work on is the area of sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a new area of discourse at the United Nations. They've only, since about 2014, started talking about LGBT rights, but it's grown very quickly, and there's now actually a special independent expert at the United Nations who tracks sexual orientation and gender identity abuses. And so the Center for Inquiry, International Humanist and Ethical Union have been trying to develop a kind of platform on those issues, because as humanists we think that we should be leading efforts in that area of human rights. We should not be seen as people who are just kind of tagging along to the back. We should be out front. This is something that we've believed as humanists for as long as humanists has existed, that we should be all equal in dignity and human rights. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on at the UN. I could talk about that for hours, but knowing that we're on a time schedule here, and knowing that I'd like to take some questions, one thing I would remind you is that there's actually a lot of international work going on by humanists and secular organizations outside of the United Nations. The UN is just one place that's centralized, and it's easy to point to because they got all the fancy flags outside, and it's easy to say that that's the place that we go to advocate. But we're actually doing a lot of international work outside of the United Nations. For example, there are 3 organizations that have programs to aid secularists, atheists, and other activists around the world who are endangered for their writings or for their beliefs. So, for example, you've probably heard about the situation in Bangladesh, where over the past couple of years you've had bloggers and authors and publishers being hacked to death in the streets as they're walking to work, as they're walking to book fairs, as they're sitting in their apartment, as they're coming home from work. There's a growing Islamist trend in Bangladesh. The government's not been doing anything to really quash it, and unfortunately secularists have been at the brunt of these attacks. So in 2015, when the attacks were really intensifying, the Center for Inquiry launched what's now called the Secular Rescue Program, which is a program that provides financial aid to individuals who are in countries who are in danger because of their beliefs or their expression, to get them out of those countries and get them to safe havens. The Center for Inquiry is not alone in this endeavor, though. The Atheist Alliance International also has a very small fund. So in certain situations, people can email the Atheist Alliance International, and they will kick them some money to get them on a plane to leave the country they're in because they're facing death threats. More recently, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, interestingly enough, has started a non-belief relief fund, is what they call it. And that gives out up to $5,000 to individuals who are, say, in Bangladesh and need to get out of the country and have a visa to get out of the country, but because they're college students, they don't have any money. So FFRF will kick them some money and help them get out of the country. So the Center for Inquiry Atheist Alliance International and the Freedom from Religion Foundation have been working very closely to investigate cases that can continue to come in and figure out which organization is kind of in the best place to provide funding to these people. And then lastly, in terms of international advocacy, as I said, there's a lot of overlap between the domestic and the international advocacy that we do. So we don't just go to the United Nations, we also go to the State Department. In fact, I was at the State Department 2 weeks ago meeting with them about the situation in Pakistan. We've had a number of secular bloggers who have been attacked and kidnapped and killed. This is a pretty regular thing, actually. The Secular Coalition, the Center for Inquiry, the American Humanist Association are pretty consistently talking to people at the State Department about things that are going on around the world to atheists and other people who consider themselves non-believers, or people who are religious dissidents. There's a very interesting case in Yemen recently where a kid, a 19-year-old kid, wrote a book about all these things in the Quran that are scientifically incorrect. And someone tried to kill him. So we worked with the State Department, Center for Inquiry, and some organizations to help get him out of the country. He's in an undisclosed place right now. We're trying to get him to a more permanent location. But this is another way in which our advocacy and our presence domestically takes a kind of international flavor to it. One of the last things I'll say, or what I'll close with, are some accomplishments and some challenges. Some of the accomplishments, people always ask me, oh, what's your greatest accomplishment? You've been doing this for, over 8 years now. So what's your biggest accomplishment? And some of them are measurable and some of them are not measurable at all. I think some of the measurable things are pretty easy to say. So for example, in Indiana law allowed that religious ministers and officials of the state, governors, mayors, things of that nature, could perform marriages. But people who are trained secular celebrants or humanist celebrants could not perform and solemnize marriages in the same way that religious ministers can. So if you're an atheist in Indiana and you wanted to get married, your only choice is to go to the courthouse. You can have your own ceremony, but you still got to go to the courthouse, which is not the same for religious people in Indiana. If you're religious, you just go find a church, you get married in the church, they sign the marriage certificate, and that's it. So we sued, saying that was discriminatory. We lost in the first round. We won in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court denied hearing the case, which means that the win was binding. So we won to change Indiana law to allow that trained secular celebrants can now perform marriages on the same level with religious ministers and other officials of the state. We're now using that court case to pressure other states in the Seventh Circuit and other states elsewhere to basically say, listen, we don't want to have to bring a lawsuit. We know we're going to win. So what you should do is just add one sentence to your marriage laws saying that trained secular celebrants can perform marriages. So that was a concrete win for us, and I think it was a very significant win for us. More recently, to turn our attention to Capitol Hill, Congress in the last session was amending and strengthening the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. So the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 did a couple things. It created, within the State Department, an Office of International Religious Freedom, which focuses on issues of international religious freedom. Started under Clinton, pretty good. The Bush years, not so good. Focused primarily on Christians. The Obama years, much better. Now, kind of in a holding pattern because they don't have any leadership right now. The other thing that the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 did was it created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is supposed to monitor the U.S. government. It's a kind of quasi-independent federal agency. We have very good relations with them as well as a secular community. They've put out a number of press releases about cases of atheists and secularists being attacked in other countries and done a lot of advocacy for us. But Congress in the last session wanted to revisit the IRF Act of 1998, provide more funding for the State Department, Office of International Religious Freedom, amend some of the kind of guidelines. And one of the things that ended up happening as a result of advocacy by the American Humanist Association and the Center for Inquiry in particular is they expanded the language in the IRF Act of 1998. Because when they passed the original bill, they really only talked about religious people. They talked about religious people and religious minorities. There was nothing in there about atheists and humanists. There was certainly nothing in there about bloggers and people who were posting about religion on social media and coming under attack for that. And so we worked with the sponsors of the IRF the bill that was coming through to amend the IRF Act, which were, mind you, staunch Republicans, we worked with them to expand the language in the IRF Act to say that the State Department needs to be tracking regularly attacks against non-religious individuals around the world who are facing violence, persecution, government arrest because of their beliefs, because of their expression. That was a tremendous step forward. To get Republican sponsors of a bill on religious freedom to include us in the bill, I think was a tremendous step forward. It was not the most perfect bill, but it was a big step forward for us. So that was another big achievement. I spoke a little bit before about the FDA and the FTC, so I won't rehash that. The Secular Rescue Program that I talked about, the Center for Inquiry hosts, and some of the other programs that FFRF and the Atheist Alliance International have, those programs have collectively saved the lives of about 50 people. It may not sound like a huge number, but these organizations have spent over $100,000, maybe $150,000 to move entire families out of countries. You're talking about, for one example, in Bangladesh, October of 2015, Islamists carry out attacks on 2 separate publishing houses on the same day. They attack one publishing house that was run by a Muslim man who believed in freedom of expression and published books about atheism, and they killed him. At the other publishing house, they attack a few people, they leave them for dead, but one of them, in his strength and courage, is able to get to his cell phone and call 911, and they're able to get police there on time to take care of them and save them. But they're in terrible condition. And one of them has a family of 4. And so we're in direct contact with a family of 4. We're able to eventually get him out of the hospital, help pay for some of the hospital bills, move them out of the country. He actually got a fellowship, and he's up in Norway right now doing a writing fellowship with a group called the International Cities of Refuge Network. It's a very long thing. It's called ICORN. But we saved essentially 4 or 5 lives right there. So, and it's a tremendous amount of work getting visas, paying money for traveling, but the secular community has saved, I mean, literally about 50 lives of some of the bravest defenders of freedom of expression, people in Pakistan and Bangladesh, people who know that when they write this thing that they're going to come under threat, but they feel that they need to write this thing, because if they don't, who will? And then, as I said, some of the things that we do are not really measurable. We have developed a very good relationship with some people, say on Capitol Hill or at the United Nations. At the United Nations, there's a special expert, they call them special rapporteurs, on freedom of religion or belief, as there is with many different areas of human rights. The special rapporteur, I remember it actually, it was years ago, it was probably 6 or 7 years ago. The special rapporteur at the time was a German theologian. And the International Humanist Advocacy Union, the Center for Inquiry, said, when you're in New York, we'd really like to meet with you, because there's a lot of stuff going on related to atheists and humanists, and we don't think that you're really up to speed on it. He said, yeah, sure, great. We sat down with him, we presented this big report to him, and he said, you know, I've never met with the atheist and humanist group before. A couple weeks ago, the UN Special Rapporteur, the new one, came to Washington, D.C. in a visit hosted by the Center for Inquiry, spent a full week in Washington, D.C., meeting with the State Department, meeting with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We did a couple of public events, and so we've gone from having literally no relationship to the UN's point person on the issues that we care about to having a very, very tight relationship with that person. So it's not really measurable in a way, but the amount, the degree to which we've kind of normalized and ingrained atheist and humanist perspectives in UN documents down the line, yet to be seen, but we know that we're making progress. The last thing I'll close with are the challenges, because you can't close a talk as a nonprofit advocacy person without talking about some of the challenges that you face. The whole thing about the Johnson Amendment, about religious groups not having a voice in politics, I've done some research on this. I thought, oh, that's interesting. They claim that they have no voice on political issues, social issues of the day. But, I go to lobby and I run into a lot of religious groups that have a lot more employees than we do. So what's going on here? So I did some digging. And I came up with a short list of the amount of money that secular and religious organizations spend per year on political advocacy. The Secular Coalition, these are numbers recent of about a year or two. The Secular Coalition last year spent $208,000. That was their entire budget, $208,000. The International Humanist and Ethical Union last year spent $343,000. That was their entire budget. The group called CFAM, which is a radical Catholic group that has a presence pretty much only at the United Nations, they spent $1.6 million. I say they're radical because they are. They put out press releases constantly comparing Planned Parenthood to Hitler, and I think that would be considered pretty radical. And you would think that they'd be kind of on the fringes, and they were for 8 years. But Donald Trump just named CFAM to the official US delegation to the recent meeting at the UN on women's rights. So the US mission was going into meetings on women's rights, and with the US mission, right next to Nikki Haley, is a group that thinks that Planned Parenthood is about the same as Hitler. They spend $1.6 million a year. The American Humanist Association, $2.1 million a year. The Center for Inquiry, $5.5 million a year. The Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, which is a legal group that brought most of the contraception cases, $5.7 million a year. So they're about in the ballpark of the Center for Inquiry. However, small difference. All the Becket Fund does is political and legal advocacy, whereas the Center for Inquiry is engaging in grassroots activism, hosting events, et cetera, et cetera. Family Research Council, Tony Perkins' outfit, $13 million. Okay. The Alliance Defending Freedom, another far-right Christian group, $43.6 million. Focus on the Family, $138 million. The U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops, $180 million. We're very small fish in a massive pond, right? So we have a massive uphill battle, and that's our most significant challenge. When we walk into a room, the Secular Coalition, the Center for Inquiry, the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, I mean, it used to be that the Secular Coalition was alone. For years, they had one guy. Maybe Herb Silverman was putting on his atheist t-shirt and going into a room and trying to advocate for these ideas, but he was alone, and people could kind of point to him and say, yeah, that's like the village atheist guy, right? Now we've gotten to a point where we have, 4 or 5 people going to a room, and if we're bringing our interns, we look even better. But we're outflanked. We go to religious freedom meetings on the Hill, and we got 4 or 5 people with us, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has 5 people, and the Alliance Defending Freedom has 5 people, and all these other groups have 5 people. So we're outnumbered, largely. The way that we've tried to work through that is by, as best as possible, banding together, both amongst ourselves to ensure that we're never really seen as kind of taking a position of our own and doing work on our own. So making sure that we're constantly in communication to try to provide as much support to each other as possible. It's kind of like when you're in the woods, and is it a black bear or a grizzly bear that you're supposed to look bigger instead of like running? Yeah, that's what we try to do. We try to fluff up our feathers and make ourselves look a lot bigger than we are. And that works only so much. But one of the other things that we've actually had a lot of success doing is partnering with progressive religious organizations that don't like what the far-right religious organizations are doing in the name of their religions. 2 organizations in particular I'll name. The Becket Fund, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and Catholics for Choice. 2 organizations that are very progressive, liberal religious organizations that support abortion rights, support reproductive rights, support separation of church and state, side with us on almost every single issue in terms of the political issues we're working on. And by doing that, suddenly the village atheist has a lot of religious groups behind them. And so when the religious groups come after you, it's much more difficult for them to say and kind of paint it as, well, those are just those antagonistic atheist groups over there. They just hate religion. Well, what about all these religious groups that are standing behind me? They don't hate religion, they're devoutly religious. Most recently, we've actually developed a pretty good relationship with a couple of new organizations at the United Nations. Muslims for Progressive Values is one of them. A very, very progressive Muslim organization, also Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which is a UK group. And what that does is it serves to even amplify our message even more broadly now, because now they're inviting us, those progressive religious groups, to come to their events and speak about the work that humanists and atheists are doing. And you'll be shocked. I mean, these religious groups, you go to speak at their conferences, and religious people are coming up to you one after the other with a million questions about your humanism. What's the difference between a humanist and an agnostic? I mean, they'll ask you any number of questions, but you're starting to open eyes and you're starting to open doors. And I think this is one of the most tremendous achievements in the past 15 years since the Secular Coalition started in 2002. From 2002 to not have any representation on Capitol Hill, to now be able to go into offices with the United States senators, to go into religious freedom meetings, to go into hearings that Congress are holding about a number of issues, and hearing our organizational names being dropped during hearings by senators, people coming up to us at meetings, ambassadors coming up to us, senators coming up to us. We've normalized to some degree our worldview. We're no longer just the village people in the corner who hate religion. We're a part of the community of advocacy. We still have a long way to go. We still have a lot more money to make and a lot more people to hire. But I think, given the tremendous amount of success we've had in the past 15 years, hopefully the next 15 years will be even greater. So I'll end there, and then I'll take some questions if you have any. Thank you.
I just want to add something instead of asking a question. We are represented at the UN by 3 members of the Secular Humanist Society of New York. We are allied with Atheist Alliance International, and our rep to the UN representing AAI is Brian Lemaire, who is a board member of the Secular Humanist Society of New York. John Wagner is a board member of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and he represents the International Humanist Ethical Union at the UN. And David Ornstein represents
AHA.
American
Humanist Association, right? So we have people in this little organization actually represented, 3 of them, actually representing various organizations, but also us at the UN. I would like to add a 4th. I asked 10 of the 14 members of the Secular Humanist Society of New York board are here. I went around and asked them, how about making Michael Dora an honorary member of the Secular Humanist Society? Unanimously, they said, yeah, let's do it. So,
that is an honor, because it's also the first event that I ever did in New York City when I took over CFI was a combined event with John. So we've been working together for a very long time. Actually, I would add just very quickly before I take the questions that you have. In terms of impact that we've had, or the growth of this kind of community visibility, there's at the United Nations headquarters uptown, there are all of these non-governmental committees, NGO committees they call them. NGO Committee on Women's Rights, NGO Committee on Children's Rights, NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief is one of them. The past 2 presidents of the NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief are preceding, that is the prior one, was Matt Cherry, the UN representative for the International Humanist Advocacy Union, and then following Matt Cherry, yours truly, Michael Dora of the Center for Inquiry. So the past 2 presidents of the NGO Point Committee at the United Nations on freedom of religion and belief have been people who are atheists or humanists. And I think, again, that goes to show that we're getting into places that we were never in before and starting to normalize our presence in those rooms. Okay, first question.
Yeah, I had a question. So I wonder what your take is on the homeschooling movement. That seems to be growing, and I know it's a combination of state laws and federal laws.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're involved with? Because I think that when people are homeschooled, they're also not getting the proper curriculum in terms of science. Other things. So do you,
So the Center for Inquiry has not been deeply involved in the homeschooling issue, which is not to say that we've not paid attention to it all. But because of lack of resources, has not been something that we've been able to work on. Interestingly enough, though, one of the groups that we've done some work with, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, their past communications person, she actually just left to take a writing job at the New Republic, but she was homeschooled down in like Southern Virginia somewhere, and has started or helped to start a kind of network of former homeschool students who are now speaking out about what they went through and how it did not really put them in a place to succeed. We've had a couple of instances in which people have come to us and spoken to us about homeschooling issues, but unfortunately it's just been an issue where we just have not been able to dig our teeth in because we just have, you know, so many other things going on. So, if you'd like, though, I can give you my contact information before I leave, because I could connect you to some of the other resources that I know are out there. So I've kind of like, if I know some other people are working on it, I've kind of like, let me know if there's anything I can do to supplement the stuff you're doing. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, we'll come around.
Okay, what I found somewhat puzzling, and I know I should,
Yeah.
is I recently heard that the UN Council on Women's Rights
Yes.
has been,
Saudi Arabia was elected to the
Saudi
UN.
Arabia has been elected as the
Yeah.
how, who voted, the particular people who voted
Yeah.
for them? Do you know who they are?
Sure. So there was some drama a year ago. Saudi Arabia, people had started putting out press releases. Saudi Arabia has been named the head of the Human Rights Council. That was not true. Okay, so that was about a year ago, right? What it was that Saudi Arabia had been elected to this very small panel within the UN Human Rights Council that reviews the applications for those special rapporteurs. So those special rapporteurs get appointed by the Human Rights Council. And there are 5 ambassadors, and they change every year, that review the applications for the special experts that the UN has. And then they suggest one to the President of the Human Rights Council, which also switches every year. And then the President of the Human Rights Council has final say. He or she can pick who they want. So everyone was freaking out. How could Saudi Arabia possibly get into this position? Well, actually, it's by virtue of the fact that they're at the United Nations. The way it works is that that panel of experts, the reason why there are 5 ambassadors is that there's 5 regional groups at the United Nations. And that panel needs to be represented by 1 member state of each of those regional groups. And the regional group gets to pick which member state they want to assign to that panel. There's nothing that we can really do about that. You can't prevent them from doing it. You can't make special rules that certain states can't work into those things. Of all places, actually, I was reading the National Review earlier this weekend, and they had a great bit about this because they wrote about this and they had written about it previously. And they said, the United Nations is actually it's not really an accurate term. Really what the UN is, I want you to think about it, is kind of like Congress in a way, right? And Congress is only as good as the people that we elect into Congress. And so the UN is only going to be as good as the member states which belong to the UN. Now, Saudi Arabia is elected to the Human Rights Council. The membership on the Human Rights Council, I think, is something that we can fight on. The General Assembly votes on the members of the Human Rights Council. There's 193 member states in the General Assembly. They vote on 50-something states to be on the Human Rights Council. So that's something that IHEU and the Center for Inquiry has actually done. We've approached some member states saying, you can't vote, you cannot support Saudi Arabia to be on the Human Rights Council because what they do is they use it to legitimize their own human rights abuses. I've been doing some digging on the Commission on the Status of Women, the women's rights thing that just happened. And it's been difficult. I mean, the UN is a very bureaucratic machine. In some ways that's bad, in some ways that's good. It kind of means that Saudi Arabia can't take over the UN and do whatever they want. But I've been doing some digging, and one of the interesting things is that the US did actually force a vote on membership on the Commission on the Status of Women. And so a lot of NGOs like ours right now are trying to do the math to figure out which member states must have voted for Saudi Arabia to get them on there. So we're still kind of in the process of figuring that out. But I think it's helpful to think about the UN in that way that, the role of the UN is not to get all the greatest human rights member states into all the great human rights mechanisms, but actually to have everyone in a room together, and hopefully the US goes up to the Saudi Arabia and says, what the heck are you doing? Now, that is a tough nut to crack because the US in particular has complicated relationships with a lot of the states, but Saudi Arabia was elected to that Commission on the Status of Women. Iran was already a member.
And this is not the first time that's been coming up
Yeah.
in the UN, more and more,
Yeah.
defeats my growing up of thinking the UN is so wonderful
Yeah.
and everything like that. So my question to you, piggybacking
Sure.
on that, is that with the things that have been coming out in the news that really deflate our inspiration of what we thought was the UN, including abortion, including anti-Israel, including other things. And all the work I'm hearing you say in
Yeah.
today's discussion about the UN, I mean, is that kind of tainted? And is there any other world organization that we might have a better impact with? Because
It's a great question.
the UN is not sounding so good.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's
And
no
are we
doubt.
spending too much energies and budget to that, where maybe we could do something better, where we're not fighting the US saying don't pay for abortions and whatever.
There's no doubt that some of this stuff has tainted the image of the UN. And I think that, unfortunately, part of that is because a lot of people don't really have a comprehensive understanding of how the UN works. You know, so people say, oh, there's some terrible human rights situation. Why isn't the UN doing anything about it? And it's like, well, what do you mean by the UN? You know, it's kind of like saying, why isn't the media doing anything about it? And the media is massive selection of different outlets that care about different kinds of things, and the UN's kind of like that as well. I think that because the UN is so massive and bureaucratic, that stuff definitely taints some of the work the UN's doing, but I also think that there's really valuable work that people at the UN are doing. And so the focus that the way we've tried to kind of focus our work is by trying to kind of elbow into those spaces and push those people along to continue doing the great work that they're doing. The one thing that for me has been an inspiration at the UN recently is that a year and a half, 2 years ago, a new High Commissioner on Human Rights, which is the highest human rights post at the United Nations, was named. He's actually a Jordanian prince. And so when he was first named, understandably, there were some skeptics. How forcefully is this Jordanian prince going to argue for human rights? Well, he has been a phenomenal advocate for human rights, and he's been going around the world giving speeches about the importance of human rights and directly responding to some kind of current political trends and leaders in the world. And I think that he, in a way, is trying to keep the UN from devolving into some of the stuff that has tainted it. Even within the UN, stuff that you don't hear about, there are still wins happening. Just one example I'll give before I go to the next question. I mentioned that the UN now has a special expert, an independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity to track the way that religion is used to violate people's right to sexual orientation and gender identity, and the way that politics is used in government to repress people. That passed last June. I was there when it happened. And I remember going in to the room before the vote, a couple weeks before the vote. The sponsors of the resolutions actually hold meetings. And so if you're a registered NGO with that badge that I talked about before, the special consultation stage, you can go to those meetings. You can, hobnob with member states. You can listen to proceedings, et cetera, et cetera. So I walk in and I notice that the room's kind of empty. That's because the Organization of Islamic Cooperation had boycotted because they were so unhappy with the fact that there was going to be this new special. They knew that they didn't have the votes, so they were really unhappy. So they said, we're boycotting it. The African Union also boycotts it. What gives me hope is that one, that still went through. So the UN has a special expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, despite the fact that you had a lot of member states saying, we're not going to work with this person at all. We're going to walk out of the room when they walk in the room. We don't want anything to do with this, right? The other thing that was heartening to me, and this is now a slight focus of some of the secular humanist organizations at the UN, is that Albania is an OIC member state. They said to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, who were leading the OIC at the time, actually, we support this independent expert, so we're not going to boycott. And they went to the meeting. And so what was great about that is that during the final voting at the UN, Pakistan or Saudi Arabia will usually say, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the OIC. And every single time they were doing that day, they had to say, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the OIC except for Albania. What we're trying to do is make that a much longer list. So we're trying to approach member states of the OIC now to say, you don't need to go along with them. In fact, you could benefit from siding with other member states on human rights issues. You don't need, there's no reason why you need to continue, going along with OIC's line. So I think there's some hope. Some member states are starting to see that there's value in separating themselves out from those big voting blocs.
Michael?
Yeah. We're timed. So one more question? We'll do one more question.
Michael,
Yeah.
First of all, I think actually part of being at the UN is it gives us prestige and us voice that amplifies the secular point of view. So it's a two-way street.
Absolutely.
It's a good reason why I should be there. Can I also ask you, you have a Twitter account.
Yes.
Could you tell everybody what that account is? Because everybody here should be following you on Twitter. I believe it's...
It's just the @ sign, and then MDEDORA, my first initial, my last name.
Okay, it's a great thing
DEDORA,
to be
yeah.
watching. One of the things I think actually the most important thing to me that the work you're doing is protection of atheists and secularists overseas and the rescue that we've done. And part of that, I really appreciate that you've reached out to religious organizations and religious individuals. We're very impressed that you had Azza Reslan on a petition in protection of Bangladesh atheists, who is a recognized Islamic spokesman in the United States. And the fact that you're working with religious organizations, to me, sounds a lot like the kinds of things that we should be doing.
It's an interesting last note, because one of the first things that when I went to the UN for the first time is I realized that atheists and humanists were not really getting respected. We don't have a place at the table. But then I started realizing that we're kind of misfits in the same way that Shia Muslims were misfits at the UN. They weren't getting the same kind of recognition either. That maybe some Hindu groups were not getting recognition either. So we kind of came together and said, what if we all work together to get to the big table? And so that's one of the more effective political advocacy tools that we've had, to just band together with as many religious groups. Obviously, we tell them up front, we have major disagreements theologically, but on particular issues, there may be some way to work together. So that's been a way of success for us.
In rescuing secularists.
Yes, I think it has been. Thank you.
Go home!
And thank you to the Center for Humanist Advocacy.